Patricia E. Kane is the Friends of the American Arts Curator of American Decorative Arts at Yale University Art Gallery, where she has worked since 1978. A graduate of Chatham College, Dr. Kane received her MA from the Winterthur Program in Early American Culture at the University of Delaware and her PhD in the History of Art at Yale University. She is the author of several books, including The American Clock, 1725 to 1865, and 300 Years of American Seating Furniture, Chairs and Beds, both from the Mabel Brady Garvin and other collections at Yale University. And she has written numerous exhibition catalog essays, articles, and book reviews. The recipient of several important honors and fellowships, Dr. Kane's most recent sabbatical grant from the Henry Luce Foundation made possible some of the research being presented today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kane.
Thank you, Ron, for that very warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here and to share this discovery with you. In 2007, this desk and bookcase, or otherwise known as the secretary, with a history of having been owned by the Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene, was given to the High Museum of Art. Before telling you the story of how we discovered its maker, however, I would like to acknowledge a number of people who contributed to this study. I express deep gratitude to the family of Nancy Fraser Parker, whose generous gift of this desk and bookcase in her memory made this important document and fine example of Rhode Island furniture making available to a wider audience. Indeed, having the opportunity to study this piece of furniture has really advanced my understanding of what was happening in Rhode Island furniture making. I'm also grateful to Ron and to Deanne Levison for facilitating my study of the desk last fall. I owe a very great debt to Kitty Farnham for finding the key document and for researching the probate papers here in Georgia of the early owners of this piece of furniture. I'm also very grateful to Kitty for introducing me to Renee Brown Bryant, who provided images relating to the piece's subsequent history. The sleuthing that's gone on for this lecture and for an article about the desk and bookcase that will appear in the April issue of the magazine Antiques could not have been completed without their help. At the time the desk and bookcase arrived at the museum, Ron, who you may know is an expert in 20th century design, asked my opinion about it, particularly whether it was made in Newport. I told him that it was certainly evocative of Newport cabinet work, but that the plainness of the interior and the simplicity of the carved shell on the prospect door, that's this little element here, were not quite as robust as Newport work. But since Greene, before his legendary career in the American Revolution, had lived in Kent County, Rhode Island, which is on the west side of Narragansett Bay, he lived first in Warwick and then in Coventry. It seemed possible that the desk and bookcase was made there. And here in Rhode Island is Kent County. Greene was born in Warwick, later lived in Coventry, and this is Narragansett Bay. Providence is at the top of it. Newport is down here at the bottom of it. However, at that point in time, which was just a few years ago, no furniture from Kent County had yet been identified, so Newport seemed to be the appropriate regional designation for the desk. With that conclusion, this investigation came to a temporary halt. It was revived the following year when Kitty, who, of course, as you know, was a former curator here at the High and who really played a very key role in seeing that early American furniture was included in the collection, and her husband Clayton, who has a keen interest in green as the architect and leader of the Continental Army's Southern Campaign, they were alerted by Kitty's sister to a lecture that was being presented in Washington, D.C. by Dennis M. Conrad, who was a contributing editor of the 13-volume publication Papers of Nathaniel Greene. And these volumes are thick, 13 of them. This man died when he was only 44 years of age, so you can tell Nathaniel Greene was a very busy individual. Kitty contacted Conrad, who directed her to this list. It's an account of Greene's expenses from the 1770s, which included the June 12, 1775 purchase of a mahogany desk and bookcase, had of Thomas Spencer, for 15 pounds, 6 shillings, and no pence. And there, right up there, a mahogany desk and bookcase, had of Thomas Spencer, and there's the cost. That was a very tantalizing clue. And when Kitty had that in hand, she called me up and asked me if I'd ever heard of Thomas Spencer in my role as project director of the Rhode Island Furniture Archive at the Yale University Art Gallery. Now, this archive comprises information on more than 2,000 woodworkers that we've culled from land, probate, and court records for all the towns of Rhode Island between 1640 and 1800. And here I'm going to take a short break for a commercial announcement. The first goal of our study is to put this information not only on the woodworkers, but on about 4,000 pieces of furniture out on the web by the fall of 2010. And here is an example. If you do a search, for instance, on desk and bookcase, it returns about 481 records. And so this will be the first web-based publication of a major study in the field of American decorative arts. So when Kitty asked if I'd ever heard of Thomas Greene, I had to put down the phone and search the database. And there I discovered that Thomas Spencer, there I discovered that Thomas Spencer was indeed working as a shop joiner in East Greenwich, Rhode Island in 1773. Now, shop joiner is the term that was most frequently used in the 18th century by artisans to describe their occupation if they worked in a small shop where most likely they were making furniture and I mean, that really was the focus of their trade. And they used this term to differentiate themselves from ship joiners, another highly trained woodworking trade that typically ship joiners were dedicated their work to doing the fine woodworking details on sailing vessels, details, for instance, like doing the paneling of the captain's cabin. And because ships are irregularly formed, doing that woodwork means shaping paneling to fit irregular contours and surfaces. It also differentiated them from house joiners, that is, people who probably spent most of their lives making fine interior paneling like doors, shutters, and overmantels. We find the term cabinet maker used very infrequently in the 18th century, at least in Rhode Island. There are lots of individuals who call themselves simply joiner, which is very frustrating because you don't know what kind of maker they are. And I will say that I think any of these terms, in today's world, we think of people following specialized trades, but in the 18th century, I think a man who had those woodworking skills could have applied them over a wide range of craft activity. So in this case, we have Thomas Spencer, a shop joiner in East Greenwich, a town that neighbors the towns of Warwick and Coventry, where Greene lived. And here you see, this is where Thomas Spencer was, and this, of course, is where Greene was. While the document that Kitty discovered is only circumstantial evidence, I think once it had come to light, what's described in terms of the style and the date really correspond exactly with the desk and bookcase here at the High. So we felt at that moment that we had really found our man. So Thomas was born on April 23rd, 1752, in East Greenwich, and came from a long line of woodworkers. He was the youngest child of Thomas Spencer, who was a shipwright, a yeoman, cordwainer, and at the time of his death, High Sheriff of Kent County, and his wife, Margaret Goddard Spencer. His paternal grandfather, John Spencer, was a carpenter, and his maternal grandfather was Daniel Goddard, a housewright and shipwright. His uncle, John Goddard, was the renowned Newport cabinet maker. Now, Thomas's father died when he was only a year old, and a couple of years later, his mother sold the family property in East Greenwich and moved back to Newport, where she supported her children as a shopkeeper, selling dry goods and provisions such as sugar and tea. Thomas and his older brother Daniel, who also became a shop joiner, were almost certainly trained in Newport. Thomas's apprenticeship probably took place between 1765, when he was 14, and 1772, when he reached his majority. And this is a view of Newport 15 years before Margaret Spencer moved her family back to the town of her birth. And I think from this painted overmantel panel, you can see that it was a very bustling port. In the foreground, we have the fort, which sits on Goat Island, which is a little crescent-shaped island that sort of protects the mouth of the harbor. Back here you have the Colony House, which was just virtually brand new when this overmantel was painted, and that was the courthouse in Newport and the sort of major courthouse for the whole colony. Up here, I'd like to point out that wind power is nothing new in America. There's a windmill up on the hill. And over in this little section here, this is Easton's Point. And this is where most of the cabinet makers lived. Now, Newport is located on the island of Aquidneck, otherwise known as Rhode Island. And the official name of the colony, and actually of the state, is Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. So Rhode Island is only this little island here. And what we have, East Greenwich is up here, and this is Newport right here. Now, each major town in the British colonies of North America developed its own distinctive style of furniture making. And in recent times, none has been more admired for the skill of execution and originality of design as the Newport School, where two families really dominated the trade, and those were the Goddards and the Townsends. So what made Newport such a powerhouse of furniture making production in the 18th century? In the era of sailing ships and mercantile trade, Newport had one of the finest ports on the East Coast. As you can see on this chart, this is the town itself, very protected by, it's a deep port, protected by this little peninsula. I think the other important thing is this is the Atlantic Ocean out here. So it's a deep protected port right on the Atlantic Ocean. Newport was definitely smaller than Boston, but as Boston's economic engine began to falter in the 1740s, Newport came into its own as a port and a furniture-making center. Rhode Island was a very small colony that produced little agriculturally and manufacturing-wise, and so waterborne trade became its economic engine. One of its chief agricultural exports were horses, and these were raised in the western side of Narragansett Bay, and they were shipped out to the Caribbean to run the sugar mills. Newport was heavily involved in the triangle trade, converting Caribbean molasses into rum, taking the rum to Africa where it was exchanged for slaves, who in turn were taken to the Caribbean and the southern colonies. Among goods that these ships took to the southern colonies and the Caribbean was furniture. And of course, on the ships, they could return with mahogany brought from the Caribbean to supply the furniture makers. Now, this plan of Newport from the 1770s shows the number of wharves that lined its edges. And as I said earlier, it's this area over here, Easton's Point, where most of the cabinet makers lived. And in fact, these two blocks right here are where the Townsend family lived, John and Christopher, perhaps the best known of those. This is Wanton's Wharf right here, and John Goddard was right in that location there. As you can see from these 19th century views, we're showing you Christopher Townsend's and John Goddard's house and shops. The shops were really relatively small. This is Christopher Townsend's shop. This is Goddard's shop. We know from a contract to build this house for Christopher, the shop was 16 feet square. Typically, most of these 18th century shops would have 3, possibly 4 benches. But I think what's interesting about these views, and these are 19th century views, so I can't guarantee these buildings haven't changed, but I suspect that the many windows you see here in Christopher's shop was to provide light to work by. And also Goddard's shop has this very big door. Again, if it was open, would provide a lot of light. And so it was in this neighborhood that the Spencer boys grew up and learned their trades. Thomas's brother Daniel, who was born in 1741, was 11 years Thomas's senior, and would have begun his apprenticeship as soon as the family arrived in Newport from East Greenwich. He began his career as a shop joiner in Newport about 1762. He was in Dartmouth, Mass, out in the Cape by 1771, and I think that's because he ran into he was sued multiple times in Newport in 1771. I think he went and tried his hand at another location. And by 1779, he surfaces in Providence, Rhode Island. This desk and bookcase has an interior drawer that's said to be signed in ink, Dan Spencer. And I think it's probably his work, although I haven't had the opportunity to see this. But I think you can see that it bears a lot of similarity to his brother's desk and bookcase, the plain panel doors, a similar 3-part interior, this very similar pointed OG feet, although in this case there's no scroll pediment, it's just a flat pediment. In 1773, the year after he was 21, Thomas Spencer was described as a shop joiner when he bought a small plot of land in East Greenwich, and it said in the deed where he now dwells. That he is in East Greenwich so soon after reaching his majority has made me wonder if he didn't apprentice there as opposed in Newport. There were about 5 or 6 shop joiners living in East Greenwich at the time he was trained. So it's conceivable that his apprenticeship took place there. But my gut feeling is that given the similarity of his desk and bookcase to the work of Newport cabinet makers, the likelihood that he trained in East Greenwich is really remote. Now, the most elaborate Rhode Island desks and bookcases have scrolled pediments with applied plaques and a closed bonnet behind the center finial with tripartite blocked facades with blocking not only on the desk but also on the fall board and on the bookcase sections. And the blocking on the fall board and the bookcase usually is capped on the most elaborate examples with beautifully carved shells. And this blocking is sort of an undulating facade, and here are these shells. And there are about 9 desks and bookcases like this one. There's also another example that has a history of having been owned by the Providence merchant Joseph Brown, and it is believed to have been owned in that town. Now, these desks and bookcases are really the ultimate in Rhode Island cabinet making, and indeed they have been studied in depth. By contrast, Thomas's desk and bookcase is somewhat plainer. It has a flat facade, no blocking down below, 2 fielded panels here, but it does have the same sort of applied plaques up here in the scroll pediment. It's closed above those, and it does have a center finial, although this part of the ball is not carved the way they typically are on the more elaborate examples. Its interior is what I call semi-blocked with a single shell and on the prospect door. In other words, these little side parts are not blocked as they are here, but this is definitely blocked. Nonetheless, Thomas's desk is one of fewer than 24 Rhode Island desks and bookcases with these particular details that we've logged in to our database at Yale. And you'll remember that there are more than 400 desks and bookcases from Rhode Island that we've recorded that survive. So, even though Thomas's is not as elaborate as some, it is an example that's really uncommon form in Rhode Island cabinet making, and in that regard, it is a really rare survival. What you typically find are the flat top examples, like his brother's desk, or in Providence, they'll simply have scrolled pediments without this very distinctive Newport feature of these applied plaques and the closed bonnet. Now, next to tall case clocks, desks and bookcases were the most expensive and complex pieces of furniture an individual could own in the 18th century. They have a locking bookcase section that's configured to hold ledgers and other volumes such as octavos. In other words, the ledgers would be held in these large, tall compartments, smaller volumes up above. And I think they're really emblematic of the owner's business activities, intellectual accomplishments, and wealth, since books themselves were really an expensive commodity in the 18th century. Not only books that you read, but think about it's an economy where ledgers and account books that kept the records of who owed you what. So keeping those ledgers secure was really essential. And so those big ledgers would have been stored in here in this bookcase section that locks. The interior compartment of the desks were arranged for the organization of correspondence and the safekeeping of jewelry, coins, and promissory notes, or IOUs, which next to the account books were the chief form of financial exchange. And those IOUs, those little slips of paper, I think typically would be kept in these tiny little drawers here. That the IOUs tend to be pretty narrow and small, and you'd keep those secure in there. Of course, this bookcase, the desk section, also locks, and this little compartment here, which has 3 drawers behind it, That also locks. So this piece of furniture was really to keep all those either coins, jewelry, but I think these important financial papers secure. And hence, if you owned one of these pieces of furniture, it really underscored your material success. In the case of Nathaniel Green, the ownership of books and ledgers was an important aspect of a life occupied in the oversight of his family's business. Green was born in 1742 in Warwick, the town just to the north of East Greenwich. He's said to have read voraciously, even though he had little formal education, on subjects ranging from military science to history and mathematics, and is said to have amassed a private library of about 200 volumes. In 1770, he moved to the neighboring town of Coventry to supervise his family's iron foundry business. And 4 years later, he married Catherine Littlefield of Block Island, who was living with her aunt and uncle in East Greenwich. So Green commissioned the desk and bookcase just before he was appointed Brigadier General of the Continental Army on June 22nd, 1775. And rather than going to Providence or Newport to buy his desk and bookcase, he patronized a local maker. And the 15-pound 6 that he paid for the desk and bookcase, which is modest compared to more elaborate examples, indicates that he decided against the additional expense of having a fully blocked and shell-carved interior. That Thomas was John Goddard's nephew prompts the question of whether he trained with his uncle. The answer, I think, can be ascertained by comparing Thomas's construction techniques to those on the 3 known slant front desks documented to Goddard. There's this example. Was that picture up while I was? Oh, I'm sorry. That's terrible. That's awful. Here he is. Very dashing fellow. This is a little portrait miniature at Yale that was painted by John Trumbull, who painted all the major figures of the American Revolution for his history scenes that he did for the United States Capitol. And this, as you can see, he traveled up and down the eastern seacoast to do these likenesses. This he painted from memory in 1792. So here's the first of John Goddard's desks. This one is at the Chipstone Foundation and has a label that reads, I'll read it to you because it's very hard to see the image on the screen, made by John Goddard of Newport on Rhode Island in New England in the year of our Lord, 1745. So do you think the audience for this label was someone in Newport? I think by identifying Newport on Rhode Island in New England, I intuit it was aimed at an audience that was geographically remote. So this simple desk is no doubt the kind of wares that Newport cabinet makers were producing for the export trade. And as you see, it has simple straight bracket feet, not curved feet. The other 2 documented desks and this one and the other 2 documented desks have the same kind of drawer construction. The drawer bottoms carry across the sides and are fitted into a groove in the drawer fronts and are nailed to the other 3 sides with running strips added to the edges of the sides. And here you see this is the drawer front. This is the board that is the drawer bottom, so you see it when you look at the drawer side. And this is the little running strip that's nailed to that. And this form of drawer construction was practiced throughout New England in the William and Mary period, that is the early 18th century. In Newport, they continued to make drawers this way well into the colonial period. The other two desks by Goddard that are documented by Goddard have ogee bracket feet, these little serpentine outline feet. And the first of these is in ink, is written this legend. It's on the back of the prospect door. And it says, made by John Goddard in Rhode Island. The other of the two desks has an inscription in the same location on the prospect door. It just says, sort of cut in, John Goddard, 1754. Now, on these two desks, the rear brackets on the back feet fit into slots that are cut into the sides of the back feet. You can see here where there's a break, how that goes into the outside of the back foot. And then on the blocking for those feet, there are two horizontal blocks that are glued to the bottom board, and then a vertical block that rests on top of those. John Goddard's desks, typically the top rail is dovetailed into the side, a little dovetail here, but he puts his bottom rail into the side by simply putting it into a slot. Although Michael Moses, in his book on Master Craftsmen of Newport, noted that Goddard's furniture didn't have the same system of calligraphy that's so prominent on John Townsend's objects, there is a system of calligraphy that exists on this desk. And you may well ask, what are these little numbers doing here? And when makers were cutting up their drawer parts, for instance, I think they used either letters or numbers to keep the drawer parts straight. Because if you're cutting a drawer side and the dovetails to meet the drawer front, the way those are hand cut, they're only going to fit one location. So if you have all these little parts stacked up in your shop, you use a number or letter system to keep them straight. And what we find on Goddard's desks is, this is on the undated example, he tends to use numbers. Here we have the number 3 inside the back of the drawer interior and up near the front corner where the side joins the front. And these are in the large drawers of the exterior of the desk. There are 11 tiny little drawers on the interior, and these also have numbers. They're probably impossible for you to see, but one's right there. This is 1, 2, and 3. And they not only are on the back interiors, but up here at the front corners. And then these are the little valance drawers where he kept the IOUs. There are 6 of them, same little numbering system. Maybe here you can make out the 2. And so on both of those documented desks, this numbering system is, pretty concise. On the dated desk, on the large drawers, we also find letters. This is the letter B in chalk. So there are numbers and letters on the Goddard desks. So Thomas's desk shares some of these construction and inscription similarities. For example, the feet on Thomas's desk work the same way, where these blocks are set against the bottom. The vertical block butts up against it. And we also find that he uses a dovetail to attach his top rail to the side, and for the bottom rail, he fits it into a slot as his uncle's construction works. We find in the large drawer, he also uses large letters. This again is a B in the back of the second drawer from the top. But this varies from his uncle. At the front corners of his large drawers, he uses these very large loopy characters to identify that as the front inside. We also find that his drawer construction is quite different. When you look, for instance, his drawers, the way they work, the bottom, this is the bottom of the drawer, fits into a groove cut in the side. So when you look at the exterior side, you don't see that bottom board peeking out there. You're looking at the side going completely down. And that's a very different way of putting together a drawer. In addition, the rear brackets on his feet don't fit into a slot on the exterior, so that's another difference from his uncle's construction. He also, behind the prospect drawers, he uses this vertical brace to stabilize the backboards. We never have found this on any documented Goddard work. We do find it, however, in Newport in the work of documented pieces by Job Townsend and Thomas Townsend. Here you're seeing a double chest or chest on chest in the Metropolitan Museum's collection that has a label of Thomas Townsend. And indeed, when you take the drawers out of the top section, what you find, and the bottom section, you find this big vertical brace that is really just stabilizing the backboards. And not only in construction, but also I think in terms of the carving. Here you see John Townsend's shell on the prospect door. Notice how lively this S here is on John Goddard's shell. Whereas on his nephew's shell, this curve is, just a little bit flatter. So what the presumption in furniture scholarship is that apprentices would have followed the shop traditions of their masters. And so I think that these significant differences in construction and decoration indicate that Thomas probably trained with one of the more than 30 other cabinet makers who were working in Newport at the time that he would have been an apprentice. And I think it's even possible that he trained with his brother Daniel, who would have begun working on his own about 1762, a few years before Thomas would have been apprenticed. Now, no other furniture by Thomas has yet been identified, and that may be because his career as a furniture maker was very short-lived. He was still a shop joiner in East Greenwich in 1776 when he married his first cousin, Mary Stafford, there. But he soon turned to shopkeeping and was identified as a retailer in Providence by 1783. And I think, as was true for lots of Rhode Islanders in the late 18th century, New York State offered the promise of greater economic opportunity, and by July of 1783, Thomas had signed an indenture to rent 2 lots in Lansingburgh, New York, on the east side of the Hudson River, north of Albany, and he's documented as being a merchant in Albany from 1786 into the early 19th century. Here you can see one of the many ads he ran in the newspaper where he's selling things like liquor, groceries, cheese, and stone lime from Providence. So here's a young man whose mother was a shopkeeper, and he takes that role as his economic livelihood as opposed to continuing as a furniture craftsman. And he dies in Athens, New York in 1840. Now there's a partially legible inscription on one of the interior drawers of the desk and bookcase at the high that allows us to construct its entire history of ownership. After the Revolution, it probably traveled with Green, who who was presented with Mulberry Grove, a plantation near Savannah by the state of Georgia. And because this drawer, as it moves in and out of the desk, on its bottom, it's sort of worn away, a lot of this inscription. But I think you can see here it said it originally belonged to General Nathaniel Greene, born 1742. It was owned by Phineas Miller. Here's the word Co. Hubbard, 60 years at New York Mills, Oneida, New York. The cost of refurbishing the desk and bookcase and new handles was $30.95 in 1916. And here in a different hand it says passed down in direct line to William Walcott, Middlebury, Connecticut. So Greene lived at Mulberry and died there in 1786. And Catherine Greene, the general's widow, relied on Phineas Miller, who was a Yale graduate and a native of Middletown, Connecticut, whom the Greenes had hired as a tutor for their children. Catherine turned to him for the running of the plantation. It's interesting to note that Miller was also a partner with Eli Whitney in the development of the cotton gin, and part of what that little inscription said was that Phineas Miller's father lent Eli Whitney money to develop the cotton gin. In 1796, Miller and the widow married, and following his death in 1803, I believe the death passed to his sister, Lucretia Miller Hubbard. She was still living in the family home in Middletown, Connecticut. She married a man named Charles Hubbard and had as her second husband a man named Marvin Thomas. So the inscription on the drawer notes that the piece was owned in New York Mills, New York for some 60 years. And it may have been brought there by Lucretia Miller, who died in New York Mills in 1857. Now, New York Mills was settled after the American Revolution. In 1808, Stuart Walcott, who came there from Rhode Island, where cotton mills were really flourishing, he comes to New York Mills and establishes cotton milling businesses there, and it was known as Walcott and Company, and by 1838 it was the largest cotton manufacturer outside of New England. The next owner of the desk was probably Lucretia's daughter, Hannah Co. Hubbard. You may recall there was a Co. Hubbard visible on the desk. And she married Stuart Walcott's son, William, in 1837. And here you see Evergreen Lawn, a rather grand residence that they had in New York Mills. And presumably the desk and bookcase lived in this house. Hannah Hubbard's son predeceased her, and so at her death in 1905, I think the desk and bookcase passed to her grandson, William Stewart Walcott Jr. of Litchfield, Connecticut. And I suspect he's the individual who wrote down most of this history on this desk, even its refurbishment and new handles here in 1916. And I say that because he published this article in Antiques Magazine in January of 1928 about a mirror by Neal and Adams that was in his collection. So clearly this was somebody who had a strong interest in antique furniture. And his son, William S. Walcott of Middlebury, Connecticut, I think is the last owner recorded in the inscription. I think that's that different hand we see recording his ownership of it. By 1968, sorry about that. The desk and book had left the Walcott family and was offered for sale by the Woodbury, Connecticut dealer Kenneth Hammett. Since the desk and bookcase was originally owned in the Green family, it may seem odd that it became Phineas Miller's property. However, I think since he had taken up the responsibilities of administrating the Green family plantations, first at Mulberry Grove and then at Dungeness on Cumberland Island, and had probably used the desk as it was intended to keep important papers organized and secure, it is likely that the desk came to be thought of as his. Happily, we now have been able to confirm its original ownership by Green and also to identify it as the work of a previously unknown Rhode Island maker. The discovery of Thomas Spencer as the maker of Green's desk and bookcase offers evidence of the kind of furniture that was being made on the west side of Narragansett Bay in the 18th century. I think for too long, any piece of furniture that had the remotest similarity to Newport work was identified as being of the Goddard Townsend school. So one goal of the study that we're doing at Yale is to identify the many furniture makers who worked in what became the state of Rhode Island and to rightfully credit their work to them. Clearly before the American Revolution, Newport was really the epicenter of furniture making in Rhode Island. We know that youths from that town, but also youths from surrounding towns, came to Newport to learn the cabinet making trade. And such is the case with another of John Goddard's nephews, Ebenezer Allen of New Bedford, Massachusetts, a little bit up from Rhode Island on the Cape. A recent study at Winterthur has established that Ebenezer returned to his native New Bedford after his apprenticeship with his uncle, and that once he was back in New Bedford, he trained his brother Cornelius in the tradition of design that he had learned in Newport. And I think if it were not for the inscription that's on this piece of furniture, it's on a backboard. Oh dear, sorry. It's on a backboard and says New Bedford, Barnstable, Cornelius Allen, Long Plain. This piece of furniture, if it didn't have that, it would be cataloged as having been made in Newport. As we've seen, Thomas's brother Daniel took the Newport style to Dartmouth and then to Providence. And of course, Thomas brought it to East Greenwich. And so studies like the ones being conducted at Yale and at Winterthur are really expanding our knowledge of the Newport tradition and, in a sense, taking us beyond Goddard and Townsend. I think this Thomas Spencer desk and bookcase offers really key information for the dissemination of the Newport style and is really a wonderful example of cabinet making in Rhode Island. And I thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
If you could say just a word about finials and brasses from Newport.
The finials as on Thomas's desk and bookcase tend to have a sort of ball or sometimes a kind of cupcake shaped base here. Typically, on the more elaborate pieces, they will be fluted on the bottom half. This ball will be divided in half. There'll be flutes here. This is just a round turned element. And then this corkscrew element sits into that. And that two-part sort of finial is quite typical of Newport. As we know from the inscription on the drawer bottom, these brasses are not original to the piece. William Walcott probably had those put on, as he records, in 1916 for the cost of $30.95, which was not an insignificant amount of money. But Newport cabinet makers, as is true of cabinet makers all up and down the British colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, are getting their brasses from England. They were imported. They're known Birmingham brass founders catalogs that survive in this country, and that's how they would have been ordered. They would have been ordered by merchants, and there are wonderful accounts that we've discovered in going through the court records of cabinet makers being unable to pay merchants for the hardware that they were buying from them. And so they would buy and some of these accounts will run for months, and it's really wonderful to be able to track if a guy is buying, I'm going to make this up, 8 escutcheons, 4 back plates, 16 handles, and you can more or less figure out how many desks he's probably turning out in a given month. And the fact that they tended to buy nails they'll buy 12 nails, and they'll buy, 16 escutcheon pins. They don't buy a box of them. They buy, little bits as they probably have money to go along. And I think because all of that hardware was very expensive, if they're so cautious in the amount of it that they put out for, that I think the number of nails a fellow will use in attaching a drawer back, and they do vary from like 3 on Thomas's desk to, I think on John Townsend, you'll find the minimum is 5. That just tallying those fasteners gives you a read on how much a certain cabinet maker was willing to expend on the materials to make an object. This woman has the microphone, but I'm sure you can get it next.
That was just brought to mind the question of how was the payment made? Was it made before, when he commissioned the piece, so that he could then buy the mahogany, or how would that be handled?
I think typically they were paid when the thing was delivered. Yeah, I don't think there's no evidence to my knowledge that they got down payments. And quite honestly, these account books that run, they will run for years. I mean, when John Goddard dies in 1785, for instance, he has accounts that his son is settling with a Newport upholsterer that go back to 1765. That's 20 years before. So your account book, really, those accounts could be opened for many, many years until you settled up.
Any idea what the original pulls and so forth would have been on the desk?
I know that Deanne has a photograph of the handle removed to see the shadow. Typically the brasses, they'll, in part physically eat into the surface of the wood, in part they create a shadow. So when you take off a brass, you can usually see what the original outline was, and I think these probably conform fairly closely. And I think because it was refurbished by this fellow who had antiquarian interests, I'm sure he probably tried to get brasses that matched, that were pretty faithful to the original.
Did you say whether that piece was ever in one of those Georgia plantation houses?
I am assuming that.
That they were, that it was?
That it was, but that's an assumption. As I said, Kitty very kindly looked up Phineas Miller's and Catherine Miller's probate papers, and unfortunately they're only in wills involved with those estates. There were no inventories of personal property. So to my mind, there's no real evidence that it actually was on those properties. But, you know, because Phineas Miller lived out the remainder of his life in the South, and it seems like the family tradition as written on the desk was he owned it. I think the assumption is it was here in Georgia.
How and why did the piece come into the High's collection?
Well, as we heard earlier, the family of Nancy Fraser Parker gave the piece to the High in 2007 in her memory. And maybe, Bill, you want to say something about that?
Well, Doctor, I want to ask a question, but I want to thank you very much for being down here. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. It was absolutely wonderful.
Well,
my question is, you mentioned that the joiners of Newport did exporting. Of the work that they did, how much was domestic and how much did they export? Was it mostly export?
I would have to venture a guess that most of it was export.
Most of it was export.
That was really how they made their money. And as you may recall, the little desk by John Goddard from Chipstone is really quite plain compared to some of these other things. So and MESDA, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, has done a survey of surviving material culture objects throughout the South, and has actually turned up a number of pieces of Rhode Island furniture in that survey that probably came down in the export trade. And most of that is really of a simpler sort. I mean, because they were sending that material out as venture cargo. I mean, they would assign it to the ship's captain to sell for them at the best price he could get, whether it was in the southern plantations or in the Caribbean. And I think that the bespoke furniture, like the desk and bookcase at the High, that would be more elaborate and would not be at the level of the stuff they made. I would say, you know, they'd send out 10 desks at a time, each one cased for shipment.
I have a question. I'm right here.
Yes.
Hey. How much communication was done by the person that would buy it with the maker?
There's not a lot of evidence of that. However, there is a wonderful court case in which a Newport merchant sued John Goddard, and his daughter had ordered a desk and bookcase, and she was quoted that this was in 1762, that it would cost 700 pounds. And when her father got the bill, it was $750. And so he sued Goddard because he didn't, you know, live up to the negotiated price. And this young woman, whose name I'm going to forget at the moment, went with a friend of hers, another young woman, to Newport, and they visited Mr. Goddard. And so as part of the deposition in the court case, this young woman offered evidence of how they went to Mr. Goddard's shop, and he said if he was going to make her a desk and bookcase, it would cost 700 pounds. And she said, oh, she thought that was very dear, and that they would go around and look at other people, which they did. And then they the woman goes on to say they came back and she had decided she wanted Mr. Goddard to make her a desk for 700 pounds. She must have, this is a young woman from Providence. She's down there shopping in Newport. So she must have seen something in Providence. And, you know, I'm just intuiting that her neighbor, so-and-so, had one of these made by John Goddard. And so she goes to him first, and she probably says, I want one like you made for Hoo-Ha. And so I think, you know, she had an idea of what she was looking for when she set foot in that shop.
I think, Pat, you mentioned a little of this, but the question about how did it end up at the High Museum, I just wanted to take it from the Kenneth Hammett Antiques magazine ad in 1968. It was then purchased by a dealer in Pennsylvania, and then Deanne Devers purchased it, and it was from Deanne that Nancy purchased it because she fell in love with this beautiful American piece that Deanne was selling. So that's the other steps that maybe you weren't clear about before. And then Nancy's family gave it to the High Museum in her memory.
First, thank you for all your information. It's been wonderful. With all the scholarly provenance research, is the fact that it was refinished in the early 1900s, does that have significant impact on its value?
I don't really think so. I think there's hardly a piece alive that hasn't been refinished. There are a few. But I think, as you can see, even from this image, the color of the piece is quite beautiful. I mean, there are some pieces that get refinished, that get skinned, that really get taken down, so and whatever surface is put on them just doesn't have a lot of depth and color. I mean, this surface has been on here almost 100 years. I'm assuming that that when Ken Hammett had it, or whoever the dealer was in Pennsylvania, or Deanne, it probably didn't get resurfaced in between the 1916 resurfacing. So it's certainly got an older finish than, I would say, the majority of pieces that are in the marketplace today probably have. And I think, you know, when you look at the Antiques Roadshow or something and they say, oh, you know, if you hadn't refinished it, it would be worth, you know, 5 times as much. They're looking at pieces that have really gotten skinned, that, you know, just don't have any life. And quite honestly, that's often things like cherry and maple that don't have the kind of intrinsic fire and color that mahogany has. I mean, this piece has beautiful mahogany. There is a lot of boring mahogany in the world, but what he's chosen for the drawer fronts and the bookcase doors and even the fall board has a lot of figure. He had access to very high quality mahogany.
It's just a thank you. Pat, thank you so much, because if your research and people that are doing what you're doing was not happening, we would still be looking at a beautiful desk and bookcase that has a supposed history, or everyone would think it's Newport or everything that isn't accurate. And so all this, she pores over records in dirty courthouses and things day after day. And it's that kind of research that brings history and art together for us. And so it's just so important. Thank you very much for making this a special piece for us.
Thank you.